All right, let's get started with some fundamentals. Open up O3 CSS Grid Fundamentals and go into the start file. I also have it open in my editor here. Now, before we even write anything, let's understand like what is a grid and what is the relationship. So I I've created this really nice diagram here that you're going to use to understand. And the idea behind a grid is that you're going to take a div or a paragraph tag or any element on the page, and you are going to display grid it. And by display gridding it, that opens up the ability to sort of slice and dice that one div that we used to have into an actual grid where it's just a bunch of places that we can place our items. Now, once you've actually sliced and diced your grid, you're going to have items inside of that grid, and then we can place them anywhere on it. So let's say I went ahead and took this div here and sliced it into a grid, and I said it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different columns. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So you can go ahead and explicitly define your columns and your rows. And then what you can do is, let me get a different color here for science sake. You can take your items that are inside of that grid, and it's going to allow us to really just lay them out wherever it is that we wanted. Oh, how does Microsoft Paint work? There we go. Some fuchsia. So like, let's say I wanted to go from here to here. Good, no problem. I could take this one and go here to here. I wanted to span it all the way across. That would be no problem like that. If I only wanted to span it 2 different ones, I could do that. If I wanted to span it multiple rows, I totally could as well. That's the whole idea behind CSS Grid is you take an element, dice it up into columns and rows. These things are collectively referred to as tracks. And then once you have all of your tracks in your element, you can take your items and lay them out anywhere inside of this grid that we want without any need for positioning, top, left, bottom, position absolute, all those sort of hacks that we've had before. Now, there's a lot more to it. There's a whole concept of implicit and explicit grid, and we're going to go into all those examples. But that's the base idea that we have there. So let's go ahead and start making our own grid. I'm in the body tag here, and I want a container. And inside of that, I want a bunch of items. So I have a div with a class of item. And inside of that, I'm going to have an item with a $sign inside of it. And that's going to give us 1, 2, 3, 4. Multiply that by 10. So dot item curly bracket dollar times 10. When I hit enter, that's going to spit out a div with a class of item and then 1 through 10 inside of it. Now, if you pop open a pair of style tags, and you can put your style tags above or below, and I'll likely be doing them below just for viewability's sake. I don't know if viewability is a thing, but just so that you can see the HTML and see a CSS that I'm writing, but more likely you're going to have your CSS being linked in a CSS file. In there, we're going to take our container and display grid, because much like Flexbox, the whole CSS grid thing is all about this sort of delicate dance between what's called the CSS grid container and the CSS grid items. So when you actually display grid on a container, you make all of its direct children, so every element that is directly inside of it, you make that a CSS grid item without having to do, there is no like display, like we don't have to take like item and say display grid item or grid it, or I don't know what it would be called, but it already is a grid item without us even having to say it. Now, simply displaying grid on a container doesn't do much. That's because we have yet to slice and dice our container into something that has a bunch of columns or rows. So the way that we can do that is the very easiest way is to explicitly say how big we would like each of these to be. So we could go into here and say grid template columns. And just go ahead and define all of the different columns that we'd want. So let's say we wanted 3 columns, each of them being 100 pixels. We say 100px, 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 and give that a save. And what's going to happen is the browser is automatically going to take this container and say, okay, well, it needs to be 300 pixels wide, because they only asked for 3 columns, each of them being 100 pixels wide. And then it will take each of the grid items. Remember, each of the immediate children of your grid container is considered a grid item. And it's just going to start to lay them out inside of the grid. So we have 1, 2, 3 columns, and then the rows are automatically created as we go on. We're going to go into that a little bit in a video or two. It's called the implicit grid, but we'll master this for now. Now, if they're all squished together, we can add something called a grid gap, and let's just pay 20px on side of that. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you some spacing in between each of your columns and your rows. Again, these columns and these rows are collectively called tracks. So grid gap is going to put some sort of like, it's very much like margin, and it's going to go in between each of your tracks. Now, well, what else can we do here? You can specify different values that you want. So maybe you wanted 200 pixels. Maybe you wanted one to be 500 pixels, and then you want one to be 50px. You can do that, and it's just going to, by default, the items that are inside of that cell are going to just be stretched across, and we'll look at some of the different properties that we can use to align them and center them and whatnot all the way across. Well, that's good. And by the way, pixels aren't the only thing that we can use here. We're going to be going into different values, but if you have, you can mix and match them with 50 rem, and that would be fairly large, or you can use pixels, you can use percentages, although before you go willy-nilly thinking about how you used to do things with floats and percentages, hold off the percentages just for now, because we are going to go into a unit called the FR unit, which will replace your need for percentages in quite a lot of these different values as you want. You can also use the auto keyword. So let me bring this back to 100 pixels auto. And what that will do is it will just sort of, you see how now, look at this, woo, as it's responsive, what that does is it says it will automatically lay out these columns that we told it to be the width, and then it will just automatically lay out the rest of them. So it gave 500 pixels here, it gave 50 pixels here, it gave 100 pixels here, and it's like, oh, I got this much extra left over. I'm going to just take it all. I'm going to automatically lay myself out, and that sets us up for kind of fluid or responsive values. Like, how many times have you tried to do that in the past, where maybe you wanted a fixed sidebar of 300 pixels, and then you just want the rest to be there? Well, that's very simple in CSS Grid, because you can just drag and drop the value here, and that one will always stay fixed value. So you can go as far as you want, or we can also use some different functions called like the repeat function. We'll go more into this, but maybe you wanted 5 that were 100 pixels each. That's going to just dice it up. It's going to repeat itself 5 times over for 100 pixels. Same thing goes for using a rows. So you could say grid template rows, and maybe you want the first row to be 200 pixels, nice and high. The next one, maybe just 100 pixels, and the third one, 400 pixels. See what that gives us. We got obviously the first one, second one, third one aligning here. Why are they going all the way across? Well, because I deleted the columns, right? If you do not explicitly define the columns that you want, how many columns do you have? Well, just one. So we could bring that back by grid template columns, 200, 500. And now you see what we've done here is we have defined 2 columns. that go top to bottom. And then we've only defined 3 rows. And you'll see after that, they sort of just start to size themselves. And that, again, that's the implicit grid that we're going to be talking about. Past that, I think that's our very fundamentals of understanding how grid works. The way that we do it is we display grid, then we slice and dice it into both columns and rows, which are collectively called tracks. And we can also space them apart using something called a grid gap. CSS grid is kind of hard to visualize because we're essentially making these things called columns and tracks and rows and gaps, and they're not elements in themselves like most things else in HTML. We're able to inspect element and change the color of it or add a border. But with CSS grid, we're making these things that are sort of untouchable. So what we need to do is use dev tools in order to get a better idea of what's actually going on. So open up 04 dev tools, and I've got the starter files open up in here. And this is just our standard div of the class container. We got our 10 items in here, and I went ahead and displayed grid on the container. Now, what I want you to do is to inspect element, and in your Firefox DevTools, you are going to see a tab here called layout. It doesn't matter which item you've actually selected, but actually you can click on the container. You can see that there's this little grid here. And you can either click that, and that will turn on and off the grid highlighting, or you can go over to the layout tab, and you see that it will automatically compile all of the different grids that are in here. Now, again, the one that we have here is the container. The only reason all these other items are showing up is because I've also displayed grid them in our base CSS. So no need to worry about those just for now. Now what we can do is go ahead and turn on the visual grid that we have there. And you'll see right away that we've got some lines overlapping on top of our grid. And this is going to help us understand where the tracks are, where the columns are, where all the different rows are. Now, there's a couple settings that we can have here. We can first turn on the line numbers, and you'll likely always want to have those on because when we get into placing items, that's going to be really helpful. Area names, you can turn that on or off. We don't have any area names yet. We're going to be learning that in coming videos. And then finally, you can extend the lines indefinitely. So if you want to extend them way off. Sometimes they're a little bit hard to see over top of what you've got, and you can change the color of the items here. Just click on that. I found that if you make them black, that's the easiest to see in all types of color. Obviously, unless your grid is black, you can change it up. One other little tip that I found in order to be able to see them, especially when we get into what did these mean, is I turn on the OS X accessibility zooming. So I can just do zoom in and out, woo, zoom in and out, nice and quick like that. Good. So let's actually go ahead and start making some columns. We'll leave this open and we'll sort of see how it adjusts in real time. So let's go and make some columns first. You can see that we really only have one column. So say grid template column, and we'll have 100 pixels and 200 pixels and see what we've got there. Good. So now you see that we have our first column, our second column, and all of our rows are automatically being put in there. So first of all, one thing we need to know is that how come that we see 3? Well, you need to know that the columns and our rows, which are collectively referred to, what are they called? Tracks. They're all called tracks. Tracks are numbered not by the actual column itself, but by the lines that start and stop them. So you're always going to have one more number than you actually do column or row. So we can start at 1, go to 2, and go to 3. Now you'll see that we have a bunch of actual different types of dots and lines and solid lines showing up here. And actually, if we add some grid gap of 20px, you'll see that we also have it. So what do these values actually mean? It's going to be helpful to sort of hold these values in our head. Well, I made you another really nice diagram. If you open up today, there's going to be line meetings.png. Open that up. And you're going to see that the solid line, what that means is that that is the start and the stop of the explicit grid. And we don't know what that means yet, but we're going to be doing it in just a second. The obviously the dashed diagonal lines mean the gap. The dashed lines means that it is an explicit track. So if I zoom really close in here, you see that these dark dashed lines are going vertically. And that's because we have explicitly created an actual column, right? Because we created a column here and we said one will be 100, one will be 200. So the fact track, so if I zoom really close in here, you see that these dark dashed lines are going vertically. And that's because we have explicitly created an actual column, right? Because we created a column here and we said one will be 100, one will be 200. So the fact that they are dark dashed lines shows us that we made those. On the flip side, we didn't create any type of rows here. They've all been created themselves. So if we zoom right in, you'll see that they are dotted. So I like to call these long ones dashed and these square ones dotted. And you see that they're a little bit more faint. They're a little bit see-through. And that means that they are implicit. Again, we'll go more into this, but that means that they have been created without us saying so, because the browser has created them. So we'll come back to that quite a bit more. But it's helpful to know that all of these lines do mean something, and having them open in your dev tools is going to be very helpful. So that's it for now. Let's jump into the next tracks and rows and gaps. Just our standard div with a class container off the grid highlighting, or you can go over to the layout tab and right away that we've got some lines coming videos I found in order to say grid template called tracks. Tracks are numbered not by the actual column. It's helpful to diagonal lines mean the gap. The dashed lines means that it is an explicit track. So if I zoom really close in here, CSS grid, we're making these things that are the starter files. Inspect element, we'll displayed grid them in our base CSS. So no need to worry about those just for dev tools, no matter which item you've actually selected, but actually you can click on the container. You can see that there's this little grid here. And you can either click that and that will turn on and off the grid highlighting, or you can go over to the layout tab and you see that it will automatically compile all of the different grids that are in here. Now, again, the one that we have here is the container. The only reason all these other Now let's jump into the next video, which is actually understanding the explicit and the implicit tracks in grid. This video is going to be one of those fundamental understandings of CSS grid, and it's something that's going to keep coming up. So let's make sure that we absolutely nail this before we move on. And that is understanding the implicit grid, implicit tracks and explicit tracks, and the explicit grid. And how we can sort of use them together in order to make a really flexible and fluid looking website. So open up O5 and the starter file that we have there. I've got 4 items here and I've displayed grid it. Let's go ahead and turn on our dev tools here so we can see how it's looking. And I'm going to make my tracks black. Good. Now let's go ahead and make sort of a 2x2 grid that we have there. First, we'll put some gap on there, 20px. Good. And then we'll add some columns. And let's do 200 pixels and 400 pixels. Now we've got a grid with 2 columns in it, and then we have 2 rows. So this is the difference between the explicit and the implicit. I have explicitly defined what the columns will be, and then I have not defined what the rows will be. So those are what are called implicit. So if you do not create them, they are called implicit, meaning that the browser says, oh, okay, well, you've made 2 columns. Great. I can put 1 and 2 there, but now I've got these extra elements left. What do I do with them, right? Like you can't just throw them out. They need to go somewhere. So what it will do is it says, okay, well, I have no more columns to put them in. So I might as well start to wrap onto the second line, and that will then create a row. So even though we did not define any rows here, they have been implicitly created. So if we then zoom in to see everything that we have, you'll see that the solid line means that that is where our explicit grid has been started. And then the dotted lines means that is where the explicit columns have been created. And then the dotted horizontal lines are a little bit lighter, and that means that they are implicitly created. Watch how that changes if we just, let's dupe this over and change it over to rows as well. And now you'll notice that if we zoom in, first of all, they are much bigger because we have defined what the sizes of those rows will be. But now if we zoom in, you'll notice that the horizontal lines that we have in DevTools here are now solid and dashed and not opaque and dotted. And that is because we have explicitly defined what they will look like. If we scroll down here, you'll see also we have a solid line, and that means that is where the explicit grid ends. So solid line is where the explicit grid starts and stops. So you can see that the column starts here and the columns end here, and then up here the columns start here, or sorry, the rows start here and the rows end here. So this is 100% explicit. Let's make these a little bit smaller in terms of rows. So maybe we'll do 50px and 100. Now here's the big question. What happens if I now add a fifth and a sixth item to this? Whoa, what just happened there? Well, we only told it that we want 2 columns, which is fine. So 1, 2. But then we only sized 2 of the rows. However, we have 6 items. So what's happening is that CSS Grid is going to say, well, okay, I'm done with the explicit grid. See how the solid line ends right here, but I've got extra items. So it's going to then create a new row for us. And that is referred to as a what? An implicit row. Good. So we've gone over these. We've got our gap, we've got our grid template columns and our grid template rows. We've done those a bunch of times. Now the question is, how do I size these implicitly created ones, right? We can go ahead and size the values for the explicit ones, no problem. But the implicit ones will look a little bit something like this. So we say grid auto rows, and the grid auto rows will define how big the rows are for when they have been added. So if I were to then add, let's do something ridiculous like 500px. Now you'll see that any extra implicitly created rows are now going to be 500 pixels high. So if I were to dupe these over into 7 and 8, you'll see that 5, 6, 7, 8, all of those implicitly created rows are going to be 500 pixels high. You might be thinking, okay, well, could I do something like this? 100 px, 500 px. And if we go and inspect it, you go on 5 and 6. Let's look at the rules here. Let's look at our container. You'll notice that it's actually crossed out, and that's actually currently an open issue at the time of recording in Firefox, is that in Firefox, you are not able to define the size of multiple implicit rows. And if we were to open that up in Chrome, you'll see that it actually does work. So you should be able to do it. It should be fixed fairly soon. But at the time of recording, you're only able to pass one value for the implicit rows. Okay. We also have grid auto columns. And let's say that would be 100 px and give that a save. Now, that doesn't that didn't do anything. And that's like, how do you get extra columns? So by default, what will happen is you define your columns, and then any extra elements will automatically be turned into rows. But that's where the next video comes in. We're going to be talking about something called grid auto flow. And that is instead of automatically giving us rows, we're going to automatically give us more columns. So I'll see you in the next video. In the last video, we talked about how when you explicitly define your columns and you don't define any rows, they are just automatically created, which is what we call implicit. Now let's talk about this thing called grid auto flow. And it's not, I don't think this is something you're going to be using all the time because it determines if your new elements are added as rows or as columns. But let's learn it just in case you ever do want to do one of those horizontally scrolling elements. So let's open up 06 and auto flow start. I've got 2 items here and I've displayed gridded it. Let's turn on our dev tools just to make sure we're sort of watching what's going on here. Now let's add 2 columns real quick. So grid template columns, 400px, 200px. Good. Give it a save.